Hello friends, today in this lecture we are going to discuss liberty, and we have already had one lecture on liberty where we have tried to understand liberty through different thinkers and also the republican notion of liberty. Now in this lecture today we are going to focus on two specific things. One is about freedom or liberty as an autonomy, freedom as an autonomy, and that we are going to discuss through the ideas of Immanuel Kant, and then we will discuss in the second part negative and positive liberty, that we will discuss through the ideas of Isaiah Berlin and some critique to that kind of conceptualization of liberty. Then in the next lecture we will focus on the idea of freedom as Swaraj, and also we will try to understand some of the contemporary debates around the issue of freedom of speech and expression, particularly related to free speech and hate speech, and then we will conclude our lecture on liberty. So, to start today's lecture, this is the basic conception that we have already discussed, that freedom is about basically individual choices and voluntarily action performed without any restrictions or constraints. So, freedom is understood as a kind of choice or voluntary action which is necessary, which is desired to be prerequisite for the utmost development of a human personality or individual personality, and therefore in many societies freedom is considered as necessary prerequisite for any kind of individual and collective growth, and we have discussed that in our introductory lecture. And there are lots of constraints, lots of restrictions on the individual action or the choices that individual makes in his or her life, and we see in many societies there are genuine tension or conflict between the choices or the decisions that individual makes and the restrictions or the control on that decisions and choice that society, family, or state or the any other collective groups or institutes pose some restrictions, some limits to that individual choice or individual decisions. So, liberals traditionally believe that a free society, so all the societies is not necessarily a free society. That means it does not necessarily automatically allow or permit the individuals to make choices, to make decisions. There are certain requirement that needs to be fulfilled for a society to be classified as a free society. So, the liberals believe that a free society is that which allows free action or voluntary actions of individuals to prevail, and at the same time it should limit the use of coercive laws by the state to reduce its interference in the individual's life. So, the prerequisite of free society according to liberals is that it must allow the individual to make choices, to do what he or she think is fit for them to do or act upon. And also then this society, as we have discussed this tension between the state and the role of a state in ensuring the conditions which then individual can enjoy for his or her actions or what he or she thinks is right, especially through republicanism. If you remember that the laws are not a kind of impediment, not a kind of restrictions, but laws and institutions are something which provide the condition for the individual to exercise his or her freedom. So, in that sense there is a tension where individuals are not absolutely free to do anything he or she wishes to do, and some of these tensions we are going to discuss throughout this course. One of the tension is then how you can justify the existence of a state or laws. So, one conceptualization of liberty is enjoyable within the limits of state or the laws and its institution. Not all actions of a state or laws are necessarily safeguarding those conditions. There you need to safeguard certain rights which we call fundamental rights in our constitution. Similarly, there is such mechanism in other constitution as well, which limits the state interference into the life of the individual. So, the free society on the one hand must allow its individual to make certain choices, to take some decisions, to act upon certain things which they think is fit for them to perform or act upon, and also it simultaneously limit the coercive laws of the state to reduce its interference into the individual life. And thus a free society should allow and permit varieties of human choices. So, there is no one singular conception of good life or what is desirable and what is not desirable. These good life or the notion of good life or desirable or undesirable is something that is best left to the individual for deciding. It is not the duty of the state or any other bodies to tell the individual what is good for him or her. So, this free society then ensures that individuals exercise maximum freedom in making certain choices, certain decisions that is about his or her life, and a state should have a very limited role in ensuring that they exercise those rights without any interference, either by the state and its laws or by the external agency. So, this free society then allows the varieties of human choice and goods. So, there is no one singular conception of good that one must abide by. They are individual. So, the assumption here is the individual is free and rational, and being free and rational, he or she knows what is in the best interest of his or her, and therefore he should be allowed to pursue those goals, to pursue those interests, and then overall it will lead to a prosperous society, to a free society, to a liberal society, and so on. So, that is the kind of conception about liberty. So, as I have discussed that in the first part of the lecture on liberty, we have already discussed and examined freedom or liberty, the concept and the difference between these two concepts, and also we try to understand it through different thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, and John Stuart Mills, and so on, and we particularly focused on the republican conception of freedom. Now, in this lecture, as I have told you, that we will discuss freedom or liberty as autonomy and negative and positive liberty. So, the first part of today's lecture will be about freedom as an autonomy, and then in the later part we will discuss negative and positive conception of liberty. So, we are going to discuss the concept of freedom as autonomy through the theoretical perspective of Immanuel Kant, and his period is 1724 to 1804, and the two concepts of negative and positive liberty through the theorization of Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin is one of the most trend-setting political theorists in 20th century who radically altered the whole conception of freedom or liberty. So, there is this tension between the term liberty and freedom that we have discussed in the introductory lecture, but Isaiah Berlin went one step ahead, where he theorized liberty, not just two aspects of liberty, but he defined or discussed it as something which is incompatible, that is positive liberty and negative liberty. So, the liberty and freedom that we understand as the same political value or political concept not just has two kind of conception about freedom and liberty, but it is altogether different understanding of liberty itself, where according to Isaiah Berlin that we will discuss, negative liberty is something which is desirable and it is true liberty for him, and positive liberty has the tendency to strengthen the authoritarian regime and something which is rooted in the psychological conditions of unfreedom and so on. So, that we will discuss. So, here in Isaiah Berlin there is a radical shift in theorization of liberty and freedom from different interpretation to a radically differentiation between the negative conception of liberty and positive conception of liberty, and then there is a critique to it that we will discuss. So first, if you discuss freedom as an autonomy, one of the things that Kant did is to combine the three concepts together to make sense of individual life, or what is good life, what is a moral life, and how that good moral life can also be a free, autonomous and dignified life as well. So he combined the categories like morality, autonomy and freedom together. So in his conception we will see how he weave together these three concepts to make sense of individual life and to bring about enlightenment, to bring about a organized, harmonious life, where the dignity of self as well as the orderly maintained without any outside interference or without any external institution. So in Kantian conception of freedom, there is a combination of freedom, morality and autonomy together. So this is one of the definition of or what we call a kind of law or maxim or formula that Kant talked about, how individual while governing his or her life will act in a particular way where he or she is not guided by any selfish or narrow contextual approach to a particular situation. He give this maxim a kind of universal unconditional application, and through that Kant believed that if individual subject his or her action or decisions in life to such a maxim where the maxim do not tell the individual what to do or what not to do in a practical given situation, but it gives the individual a moral framework through which one can legislate the laws or take a decisions which governs his life. Now in taking that decision or following that course of action, he must abide by this a priori maxim, what we will discuss as a categorical imperative. And in doing that, Kant believed that individual can then be a autonomous person, in a sense that there is no one else or the external body which tells the individual to do what to do or what not to do, but he himself or herself legislate the law which governs his or her life. So in doing that, Kant connect it with the concept of morality, the concept of humanity, the idea of universality or unconditionality as well. So if you look at this definition, that act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should, that maxim should become a universal law. So that means the in a given practical situation in which you are, you follow a particular course of action or you take certain decisions which you want others to follow in the same situation universally and unconditionally. And if your course of action or if your decisions are according to that maxim which you want other to follow universally and unconditionally, then your course of action is justified. It doesn't require any external approval, it doesn't require any other justification, it is justified in itself. The maxim is the justification for the course of action. So we can understand it through many examples. One of the examples that one can use is whether you should follow certain means which you don't want others to follow in achieving certain ends. Now following of that means may lead you to some immediate gain, but it may not be something which you want others to follow. Then should you follow that means or not? So the maxim says that you follow only that course of action which you want others also to follow in the same situation universally and unconditionally, and that gives a kind of deontological understanding of laws, legislation, so on. So we can move on to understand this concept of this maxim while discussing his conception on freedom as on autonomy. So the understanding of freedom as autonomy is derived from Kant's notion of freedom. He explained freedom or liberty as self-government, and this idea of liberty or freedom as self-government we will also discuss when we will discuss freedom as Swaraj. So he explained freedom or liberty as self-government, that it is individual to govern one's own self and self-direct his or her life without being directed or interfere with or restricted by others. So in this maxim, the individual makes certain decisions on his own. There is no one else. Only condition that he or she needs to meet is that this course of action must be followed by others universally and unconditionally in the same situation. So in freedom for Kant is this idea of governing one's life, where the direction that you take is self-legislated. An individual is free to act or to do by applying his or her own reasoning capacity or from his or her own laws, not the laws of other or the external agency. So that an individual gives to oneself. So here the individual as an agent, individual as an must act himself or herself. There is no one else to tell him or her what to do, what not to do. So the laws that individual follow, which we want at the same time to be universal laws. There is no kind of self specific or context specific approach to the course of action. So you want yourself to follow certain course of action which you want other also to follow, and not just make exception to yourself and then wants other to follow something else. So that kind of hypocritical approach is not there in Kantian conception of categorical imperative. So the autonomous self is thus free, and autonomy for Kant means self-legislation of laws that govern oneself. So his basic idea revolves around the idea of human autonomy. So the justification of law is on the basis of its legislation by the individual themselves and not by the external agency. So the Kantian understanding of freedom or liberty is intrinsically related to the notion of autonomy, that is law itself. So this maxim is a kind of framework, it's not a law. The law that individual follow to govern his or her life is self-legislated. The only condition that the individual needs to meet is that that law must be something which he or she wants other also to follow or legislate in the same condition universally and unconditionally. So in that sense the individual govern his or her life by the legislation which he himself legislates, and that gives him the autonomy, the freedom to make himself subject to laws which he himself legislate and not the external body. And in that sense individual for Kant being rational, capable of reasoning and having a moral sense. And what is this moral sense we will discuss in the next slide. This combination allows the individual to really exercise his freedom in true sense of the term. So he pointed out that law as moral law, which means that I know myself as a free person. Now in knowing this self as a free person, and then how this person ought to behave in the community among the others individual, is something which must be guided by a sense of morality or moral laws. Now on Kantian conception, whatever we are discussing, you can also refer to his book called Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Moral, and many of these things I am discussing today in this lecture is from that book. So thus the derivative meaning that an individual obeys the moral law that is created by himself and herself. So hence everybody needs to comply with his or her own set of moral laws. So here the source of moral laws is not then in religion or any practices or any ethics which is outside or external to the individual. So individual himself or herself must act according to his or her own ethics. Now in developing those ethics, those morality, individual, the assumption being is a rational person knows how to treat other. Now in this connection he has developed a conception called kingdom of ends, where the idea is that everyone must have one's own dignity and also recognize the dignity in others. So the relationship between two individuals should be not guided by the personal selfish interest, that means using the other for one's own benefit, but to treat other as an end in themselves. And that's the morality, that's the ethics, where he believed that if a society which treats everyone with dignity, that means treating everyone as an end in themselves and not for you as a means to be utilized for your own purpose and so on, then the society will be peaceful, harmonious, prosperous and so on. So the ethics or morality that Kant talk about is also then rooted in this understanding of individual being rational, knowing how to treat himself or herself and also how to treat other. So the Kant's understanding of ethics is grounded on the concept of free will, not in the text, not any practices or ethics that is outside the individual or external to individual, and freedom as autonomy. So according to Kant, morality and freedom is interrelated and there is a kind of reciprocity. So in other words, both these concepts share a reciprocal relationship. For him to act or to do something freely or without restrictions from outside is to exercise true freedom. So the meaning of true freedom is doing something without any restrictions from the outside force and external force, and yet the individuals must subject his course of actions or his decisions to certain ethics, to certain morality, to certain laws that he or she himself or herself legislate. So the only correct way to exercise freedom is to act morally or through one's moral action. So true freedom thus is determined by moral action of the individual, not by the selfish, narrow motives or the course of action, and that cannot be justified as freedom in Kantian conception. So the freedom or free agent or the free individual must be autonomous, use his or her rational capacity to legislate the laws which govern his or her life. Now this rational law is something which must be self legislated. So in this conception, the true freedom for Kant is not the narrow selfish motive of the individual, but something which should be subjected to categorical imperative. So Kant used the term categorical imperative, or what we call CI, to explain the moral laws that is used to exercise freedom or liberty. He states that the moral laws do not have certain conditions to follow, to do something or to act. Rather, it is unconditional in nature. So it applies unconditionally and universally to everyone in the society. So it does not make exception to anyone. Categorical imperative is universal, unconditional, and does not make any exception to any individual, and everyone must subject himself or herself to this maxim. So categorical and hypothetical imperative, then we can better understand what Kant mean by categorical imperative. So categorical imperative is governed by the principle of universality, humanity and autonomy. So all the three conditions of first universality, that is without any exception, without any conditionalities, not context dependent. So, it is applicable universally without any exception or conditions. The second is the idea of humanity. You must have a sense or a moral ethical response to the other individuals. So, the Kantian conception is not making exception for yourself and do not allowing that exception to the others, but to subject yourself to the same ethics, to the same law which you want others to follow. And that is how a society respect each other's dignity or existence, and it will ultimately lead to a more prosperous, peaceful and harmonious society. So, the idea of humanity or the other individuals is inherently there in this conception of freedom as an autonomy. And then finally is the autonomy that we have discussed. It is about self-legislation and so on. So, the categorical imperative, if it meets these three criteria of universality, humanity and autonomy, is in good in itself. So, if you follow certain action which meets these criteria, then these action or decision is good in itself. It does not require any justification or approval from outside. So, that is the categorical imperative. Hypothetical imperative on the other hand is what you see in real practical life. So, people, individuals or groups taking certain course of action by having some pre-designed ends or goals in mind. So, their course of action is justified not by itself, but on the condition where that course of action has led to that particular goal or end which that individual or group designed for themselves beforehand. So, the hypothetical imperative is something where meeting predetermined ends or goals justify a particular course of action. So, in other words, whether an action is good or bad is determined not by the action itself, but on the basis of whether that action lead to desired end or goal or not. So, that is the hypothetical imperative. Kant is talking about the categorical imperative as the basis for individual to subject his or her law or action or decisions in life. Further moving on, the real happiness lies not in this hypothetical imperative, but in the categorical imperative which meets this criteria of universality, humanity and autonomy, and there the justification is not guided by achieving certain ends or goals, but the action itself is justified. So, it does not require any further approval or external justification. So, Kant talked about this categorical imperative as the basis of human true freedom or autonomy and morality. So, according to him, human beings are able to act or choose to act or do something by using a maxim, and this is that maxim, the categorical imperative, and this maxim is something that is self-legislated, as I said, that there is no clearly written law for the individual to follow. Individual himself legislate that law, but while legislating that law he must follow certain conditionalities, that is the universality, humanity and autonomy. So, this maxim is self-legislated and a priori, that means before the action starts, this framework is acceptable unanimously to everyone in that society, in the humanity as such. So, this maxim which guides the individual to follow certain course of action or to legislate certain law is something which is a priori, that means beforehand there is some common understanding about this maxim called categorical imperative. So, that is, it gives the individual a predetermined moral framework to work and act in a particular way in a given situation, and yet remain free and autonomous, and that is how he defines freedom as an autonomy, where individual while acting in a particular way in a particular pragmatic given situation must follow certain moral framework, and this moral framework, as I have discussed in the previous slide, is that act only on that maxim by which you can act at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. So, the action that you follow, you want others to also follow it. It should be universally applicable and not just to you and in that particular context. And that's how individual can, while governing oneself or taking a particular course of action, will remain yet free and autonomous about his or her lives. So, this categorical imperative gives the individual freedom and moral autonomy to legislate the rule he or she himself and herself legislate. So, that is this idea of freedom as an autonomy. Now, if you look at this negative and positive liberty, this is Isaiah Berlin major conceptualization of liberty, where, as I discussed in the beginning of this lecture, it is not just two aspects of liberty, but it is seen as opposite to each other. And Isaiah Berlin thought that negative liberty is the only liberty. Positive liberty is something which we must not accept or acknowledge as liberty at all, because he considered it as something rooted in the psychological condition of unfreedom. So, the concept of negative liberty and positive liberty are coined by Isaiah Berlin in his work Two Concepts of Liberty, and his distinction between these two specific kinds of liberty has put forward another dimension to understand and examine the notion of liberty, which we will discuss now. So, the first is negative liberty. It is basically understood as freedom from. So, it refers to those external influences, factors or interferences that restricts the freedom or liberty of the individual. So, freedom from means those area, those conditions of individual life which is free from the interference or restrictions or limitations set upon by the external individuals or agents. So, it can be also understood this negative liberty as an answer to this question: what is the area within which the subject, that is individual, a person or group of persons, is or should be left to do or be what he is able to do or be. So, without interference by other persons. So, that area of life where individual or group of individuals are or should be left free to do or to be whatever he or they want to be or to do is liberty, and there should not be interference by the other person. So, the negative liberty can be understood in that sense, where it talks about the conditions of liberty which is free from the external interference and restriction. So, it is freedom from. So, Berlin states that if I am prevented by others from doing what I could otherwise do, I am to that degree unfree. So, what I want to do, but I am restricted from doing that by others, that degree of restrictions is a restriction on my freedom. So, it is only understood as those areas where individuals are left free to do what he or she can or should do. So, and if this area is contracted by other men beyond a certain minimum, I can be described as being coerced or it may be enslaved. So, in this conception, Berlin pointed out that external interferences thus restricts individual freedom, and freedom is understood as something which is free from any interferences or restrictions. So, he believed that such restriction cannot affect the capacity or capability of individuals to achieve their goals and aims in life. So, here this distinction must be understood, that being free and the willingness to be free, that means the agent will to act, is not understood as the condition of unfreedom. The condition of freedom or unfreedom is only when there is interference or any restrictions imposed on the individual and his or her sphere of life by the others. The incapacity or incompetence is not regarded as the conditions of unfreedom in this kind of conceptualization. So, he believed that such restrictions cannot affect the capacity or capability of individuals to achieve their free goals and aims in life. So, he considered that incapacity to achieve something in life or to achieve a goal is not unfreedom. For him, every individual knows better about their own interests or desires, and none should interfere in it therefore. And minimum or limited role of state should be allowed to restrict interference in the individual life. So, there should be a kind of minimal control or restrictions by the state to ensure that individuals' lives are not interfered with by other individuals or group of individuals or society as a whole. So, here the idea is that the freedom is only the condition, the opportunity for the individual to pursue what he or she thinks is good for them. In pursuit of that good, they should not be interfered or restricted by others. So, so long as they are restricted and to the degree those restrictions are there, that condition can be considered or regarded as the condition of unfreedom, which should be the minimal, that is the role of a state to ensure that individual have the maximum conditions of freedom to pursue his or her interest without any interference by the other. Now, if you look at this positive liberty, it is understood as freedom too. So, it is in contrast to the negative conception of liberty, which is about freedom from any interference or restrictions. It is freedom too, and that means freedom to be something, to realize oneself, to self realization or self actualization. So, freedom as an idea or a political concept is required because it allows the individual to realize himself or herself or the collectivities to pursue those goals or those objectives which is in their understanding good for them. So, positive liberty talks about this freedom too. So, this can be understood as an answer to the question what or who is the source of control or interferences that determines someone to do or be this rather than that. So, what to do and how to use one's freedom. Now, positive freedoms talk about this what to do and who is going to tell what to do or what not to do. What is the source of that control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that. So, answer to this question is understood as positive freedom. Further on, Berlin states that the positive sense of the word liberty derives from the wish on the part of the individual to be his own master. I wish to be the instrument of my own, not of others' men acts of will. So, I wish above all to be conscious of myself as a thinking, willing, active being, bearing responsibility for his choices and able to explain them by reference to his own ideas and purpose. So, this notion of freedom or positive freedom is about self mastery, not just a kind of condition as in negative liberty of individual domains which is free from outside individuals. The positive liberty emphasizes on the idea of becoming, the freedom to realize oneself, to be the master of oneself. Now, the danger in this positive liberty is its misuse or abuse by the power to be, which tells the individual or group of individuals what is good for them. Now, that problem we will discuss in a minute, but basically the freedom as its positive connotation according to Berlin is about freedom to rather than freedom from, freedom to become someone, to realize oneself, to achieve one's mastery over self and so on. So positive liberty refers to the attainment of complete freedom without external pressures or restrictions or constraints. It is the idea of freedom to act according to one's own terms in a free atmosphere without any control or regulation. So thus it refers to the freedom to do or to act. There is a law that guides individuals to achieve their goals in life. So positive liberty makes individuals free from any kind of coercive or oppressive forms of power and liberates individual self, and it helps to develop a free personality. So Berlin states that positive liberty refers to the idea that a self possesses two kind of specific selves. These are called higher self and the lower self. The higher self is influenced or motivated by reasons or rational practices that transcend desires or self interest of the lower self. So basically in this connotation or conception of positive liberty, according to Isaiah Berlin, individuals carry two kind of self. One is lower self that talks about the selfish desire or self interest or pursuit of self interest and so on, and then there is the higher self which talks about reason, rationality, which transcend the limits of the self and so on, and that you can connect to this in a way hypothetical or categorical imperative as well, as we have discussed. So the positive liberty is something that allows the individual to become someone, and in becoming that someone, that is regarded as the freedom and not merely the conditions of freedom as in the negative liberty. So Berlin was very critical of positive liberty and argued that its support lies in the psychological source of unfreedom. So the individuals in this sense can be manipulated by others or other external agents, groups or institution to achieve certain things, and that's kind of situation where individual may think he or she is free, but actually he or she is not free, or he or she is forced to be free, or as we have seen in the Rousseau. So this psychological source of unfreedom allows the other to exercise certain control over one's own life or group's life and so on. So such individuals are deemed to be forced to free, so by others who tells them what to do, what is freedom for them and what course of action they should do. So in other words, he was critical of this authoritarian or totalitarian misuse or abuse of the positive concept of liberty, which talks about freedom to become something, and in that becoming, what that becoming is and what it is not is determined by someone else. At least there is chance that it will be determined, manipulated, abused, misused by the totalitarian and authoritarian regimes that tells the individual what to do and what not to do. Now this suspicion of misuse, abuse or manipulation of positive liberty allowed the Isaiah Berlin to criticize the positive conception of liberty, and he considered freedom as a negative understanding of freedom according to him, that is about freedom from any restrictions from the outside, and he was the champion of the negative freedom. And for him the negative and positive freedom in that sense is not just two aspects of freedom, but two kind of freedom which cannot be reconciled, which cannot be compatible to each other. It's a kind of opposite or different from each other, where he was proposing that the liberty means only freedom from, in other words, the negative liberty. Now if we assess this idea of negative and positive liberty, we will find that this analytical distinction between negative and positive liberty or freedom is not tenable, as many scholars like Charles Taylor, Gerald McCullum have pointed out. Now they have argued that such a simple and straight dichotomy or differentiation between these two conceptions of liberty simply do not exist. So freedom from is not just sufficient in itself, it must include something which is more than just the condition of freedom, that means the opportunity of freedom. So if one is left free, that space of or conditions of freedom is not good in itself. The more significant part of that condition is what that individual do about that condition of freedom. So Charles Taylor has pointed out this inadequacy of the negative liberty which Berlin has argued about as self-realization. So Taylor argued that negative freedom may be a necessary prerequisite. That means you need a space where you are free from any restrictions, limits, control by the others. But that in itself is not enough for self-realization. There may be chances of abuse of that freedom or conditions of freedom by the individual themselves. So if they make hasty decisions, if they go and take drugs because he or she considers that it is good for them and so on. So there is some moral elements attached to this idea of what to do with one's on freedom or conditions of freedom. So Charles Taylor argued that negative freedom may be a necessary prerequisite, but in itself it is not sufficient for self actualization or realization. It also includes the part of what to be. This we can more clearly understand by Gerald McCallum about this triadic relationship between this conceptualization of liberty, which includes the simultaneous existence of three things. One is an agent or a person who is free or unfree. So understanding of freedom requires an agent who can be regarded as free or unfree. The second is the constraints, restrictions or interference and barriers that make the agent free or unfree. So what are those restrictions, what are those barriers, what are those interference which can be regarded as a imposition of freedom or unfreedom on that particular agent. Then the third is what it is that person is free to do or not to do. Now this becoming is something which is also inherently related to the conceptions of liberty. So liberty cannot be understood merely as a freedom from any interferences, but also it must include those constraints, restrictions which set certain limits to the freedom or unfreedom, and also then the individual acting upon and doing something while trying to become someone and so on. So the liberty, the idea of freedom is this triadic relationship between the agent, conditions, and the agent facing the conditions and becoming something. All these three things are interrelated. So in that sense, it is not easy for anyone to differentiate between the negative and the positive liberty, as Isaiah Berlin has argued in his work. Now if we make a comparison between Isaiah Berlin and Kant, the main difference between Kant and Isaiah Berlin is the fact that Berlin emphasized on the individuals being a free agent and the conditions that make an individual a free agent, that means freedom from, whereas Kant focused on the intrinsic relationship that exists between morality or moral laws and with application of reason or reasoning capacity that makes an individual free person and allows him or to exercise freedom in true sense. So for Kant, the freedom and the idea of freedom and realization of freedom is not something which is good in itself or which has value in itself. It must have connection between autonomy, morality, and also the humanity. So those conditions ensures the true realization of freedom in Kant and not merely the conditions of freedom that Berlin has argued about. So Berlin criticized many rationalists including Kant, Locke and Rousseau and pointed out that rationality or reason is incompatible with the notion of freedom, because in his conception of freedom, freedom means those area which is free from restrictions from outside. So he rejected the view that a moral higher self can dictate over the lower empirical self of human being. So Berlin called such moral or rational laws as fictitious in nature. It does not exist simply, and if it is there, the chances of manipulation by the totalitarian and authoritarian regime is always there. And therefore Berlin was very suspicious of this higher order self or moral assumptions. Kant believed that the universal moral law is necessary to be a free person, as we have discussed while explaining the term used by Kant, categorical imperative. But for Berlin, freedom is more about freedom from constraints that leave the individuals to do what they think fit for them to do. So Kant can be regarded as a thinker representing, in whatever we have discussed, as a positive liberty, means freedom to be. So the freedom here is to be realized or exercised by a free rational agent by acting upon certain principles, and not merely the conditions of freedom that Berlin talks about. So as his concepts of freedom or liberty focused on self-government of human being, that is, an individual is free to act from laws, or more specifically moral laws, that an individual give to himself or herself. So the self-legislation part of the law is very crucial for Kantian conception of freedom. These laws are not imposed by any other external forces. However, Kant at the same time focused on the application of reason or rational faculty that makes person to think and act freely as one wishes without any constraints or restrictions or external interference. So in this Kantian conception, the freedom, autonomy, morality and a rational free agent is very much interconnected in the realization of true freedom, and not merely the negative freedom as we have seen in Berlin. Now to conclude this lecture on Kantian notion of freedom as an autonomy and the Isaiah Berlin differentiation between negative and positive liberty, so we must understand that being a normative concept, liberty is open to multiple interpretation and sometimes very opposite kind of interpretation as well. Now, however, what makes the liberty or freedom a central concern is its constitutive element. So, freedom is not merely a condition, but it has some elements which constitute the individual, which constitute the society, and that makes the freedom more desirable than anything else. So, the individual society can do something only when individual and society is free to do that thing. Now, that being free and to ensure what that freedom is always something which is value loaded, which is normative and therefore subjected to multiple interpretation, and some of these we have seen. A part of it we will discuss when we will discuss this idea of hate speech and free speech. So, these constitutive elements permits the individual and collectivities to develop itself without coercion or external interferences, and hence to be considered or regarded as free, certain conditions must be met, but that it itself is not sufficient unless one also act or will to act upon those conditions of freedom. So, freedom makes sense when individual and collective body tries to become something, have the will to do something or to become something is something equally important than the conditions of freedom. So, one is free to do something is not sufficient in itself. One must also act upon that conditions of freedom to become something, and that is the constitutive element of freedom which must be also taken into account. So, in other words, freedom is not merely about an opportunity to be left free, but it also must include the elements of acting upon those opportunities of freedom to realize oneself, whether it is individual and collective. They must act upon those conditions of freedom, and only then freedom helps in constituting the self, to realizing or self realization of individual or collective self, and that makes the concept a central concepts in the political discourse. So okay, whatever we have discussed in this course, you can refer to some of these books. One by Immanuel Kant, Groundworks of the Metaphysics of Morals; the Isaiah Berlin, Two Concepts of Liberty, from his 4 essays on liberty; and Gerald McCullum, Negative and Positive Freedom. You must read to understand the critique to Isaiah Berlin, and also some of the other books which we have been referring to, like Norman Barry, Bhargav and Acharya, and Hoffman and Graham. These are the books which you should refer to understand these concepts, and also Katerina McKinnon, Issues in Political Theory. So these are some of the texts which you can refer to understand freedom as an autonomy, and the concepts of negative and positive liberty that we have discussed today. So that's all for today's lecture. Let us know what you think about the lecture. Write your comments and queries. We will be happy to respond. Thank you for listening.